So I'm going to unmute the... Hi, everyone. We're just going to start testing a little bit. Thank you for those of you who have arrived early. If you can hear and see me, then if you can just tap yes in the chat window, I know that everything's working. All right, and we'll start at 10 o'clock sharp, 10 o'clock PST in about 3 minutes. I'll just mute my microphone for a second and switch off my camera, but just stay put and we'll be with you in a moment. Actually, one more thing, Tammi is with us on a phone line. So Tammi, if you can quickly say a few things, just want to make sure people can hear you properly. And again, if you can just type in the chat window if you can hear us.
Good morning, everyone. I'm joining from Ojai, California. And I hope everyone can hear me okay.
All right, looks like that's working. So just give me 2 minutes and we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll give it another minute or so before we really get started. There is still a couple of people joining. If anyone has trouble hearing us, just please let us know through the chat feature. Tammi is actually joining us remotely, so you'll hear in a moment. You won't be able to see her, but you'll be able to hear her. We're trying to pull off what for us is a huge technological feat in beaming her in from Ojai, California, where she's in an area without any internet access, actually managing a retreat right now. Tammi, can you hear us?
I can hear you. So we've done pretty well perfecting the art of remote hosting, and now we're trying to remote webinar. We're trying remote. We're going to the next level of being remote, I guess.
Yeah, so
we didn't anticipate that I wouldn't have internet access, and then I got here and it's very limited, and phone coverage is very limited. So we're doing our best to make sure that I can be with you all.
And I'm just looking at the chat window. It looks like everybody can hear as well. So let's jump relatively quickly into the actual presentation. Let me start with a little bit of background. This presentation sort of came out of necessity, or the topic that we're discussing came out of necessity, in that Tammi and I are both remote hosts, which means we're almost never at our place when we host guests there. We're also very particular about how we host, and we'd like our personality and our hosting style to shine through even though we're not there. So that's the topic of today's presentation. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to the actual slide presentation. So if you bear with me for just one moment, we'll make that happen. And hopefully everyone can see the title screen right now. Again, if you can see the title screen, we're good. And if not, just type something into the chat window and we'll respond to that. So let's get started. Tammi, you want to start?
Sure. So as Alex said, we started talking about this because we have the good problem of being, we both travel a lot for work and to see family. And Alex lives in San Francisco, and my primary residence right now is in Seattle. We also have a property in New Zealand. And so that means that we're traveling about quite a bit for all of those reasons. And we know that there are other reasons that people want to be able to, or sometimes out of necessity, are hosting remotely. It could be that you have a full-time job, and so you're not able to be at your property when a turnover is happening. It could be that you're called away in an emergency, or if an illness comes up. There are all kinds of reasons that we want to have a backup plan for being able to, essentially have someone else manage our turnover. So, but in that, we also want our guests to have a really good experience. I've been hosting for a little over 2 years in Seattle. It's my primary residence. It's the place that I rent on Airbnb when I'm out of town. And so that's been a unique experience. I was 6 months into hosting the first time that I needed to figure out how to host remotely. I planned a trip to England for 3 weeks, and I didn't want my house to not be used during that time. And so I had to sort out how to do that and how to do that well. And so have learned a lot over the last year and a half. And Alex and I met in November of 2014 at the first Airbnb Open, and then became a couple several months later. And so now we're hosting remotely even more when we're bouncing back and forth between our respective cities.
Yeah, so that's kind of our story in a nutshell. So we are remote hosts by necessity, and we're really remote in that I think it's a 7,000-mile distance between our place in New Zealand and our place in San Francisco and Seattle. So we're really far away, and there's not much we can do. So things have to, since we're not there, so things have to run on rails. A little bit about myself. I started hosting 2 years ago, and it was sort of a very interesting experience for me. I really, really like the hosting part, but I'm never there. So I try to learn tricks on how I can make my guests feel like they know me or feel like they're being hosted while actually giving them privacy and while actually not being on site. So it started as a bit of an experiment. I ended up playing with a couple of technology tricks. So I looked at access technologies. I looked at how I can use checklists effectively to manage my turnovers. That's a separate topic that we'll glance on today a little bit. And as a result of that, I ended up starting a company that provides an app for free to Airbnb hosts that allows you to manage your turnovers remotely. But let's jump into the actual presentation. And I saw 2 questions come up about where you can actually get this presentation. On the first slide, we had our email addresses, which is alex@getproperly.com and simstammi@gmail.com. We'll show you those again on the last slide. So if you didn't have the time to take those down, you can still see them on the last one. And all of the material that we covered today, you can download from getproperly.com. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, there's a little section called a remote superhost. So you can download the entire presentation, plus a source file that tells you about all the different sources and ideas that we've been talking about. Let's jump into the actual. Sorry, Tammi, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add a little piece. Alex and I first did this presentation at Airbnb Open 2015 in Paris last November. So you can also access a live version of our presentation in Paris online.
Yeah, and that's you can do that from the Airbnb YouTube channel, and you'll find it if you just type in remote superhost. You'll find that live presentation there. What you see is a beach shack right now, and that's actually, it's an Airbnb, and that's the place that was Tammi and I's first date. What struck us at the time is this was an amazing place, and we loved hosting, but we also realized that hosting really tied us down because we're very particular about how we'd like our places to be presented and to be managed. We felt we couldn't be away. So to us, it would be a dream if we could relax in the sun at the same time that we know and that we have the peace of mind that our home that's generating some income for us through Airbnb is paying the bills. So that was we started discovering at Airbnb Open when we gave our presentation that dream is shared with many other hosts. And what we're going to talk today is about 27 ideas on how to make that a little bit easier. Now, this is not just about jetting off into the sunset. As Tammi said earlier on, there's many other reasons people have why they can't be there. It could be work, it could be family. So there's many reasons you might have why you can't be at your house while you're hosting guests. And we're going to talk about ways to make it easier for you and to help you have the peace of mind while you do that. Let's talk really quickly about our listings. Tammi, why don't you start from yours in Seattle?
Sure. So this is a picture of the living room of my home. As I said, it's my primary residence. And so it's 2 bedrooms and 1 bath. And during the time that I've had it on Airbnb, I've probably hosted close to 100 groups of guests now. And I've had almost 100% great experiences and have had some lovely guests, and it's been really good. Even though, for the most part, I don't often, because I rent the whole space, I'm not often there to meet or have a personal interaction with my guests, but I've still been able to really create a personable experience and really establish good communication and relationships with guests.
My listings are in San Francisco and in Tasman, New Zealand. In Tasman, New Zealand, I actually have a tent. It's a glamping tent that's almost ready for hosting. Tammi and I have been working on that for a while now to get it ready. The point that I wanted to cover here, jumping straight into the next one, is when we're not there, we tend to get anxious about our guests. How do we make sure that the smiling faces, this is actually a group of Tammi's guests that you're looking at, how do we make sure that that our guests feel comfortable, feel hosted, that everything works, and that we hold on to our 5-star rating?
And one of the things for me that's very important is I wouldn't try to be a remote host if I couldn't do it in a way that delivered a 5-star experience for my guests, because I take really seriously, when I travel and when I'm spending money to go travel, I want to have a great experience. And so I take that responsibility very seriously, that people are coming to my city, they've chosen my home to stay in, and I want to make sure that I, go above and beyond to make their experience in my home and in my city a great one. So if I wasn't able to do that while being in a remote location or while being elsewhere, I wouldn't do it. So just to say, Alex and I both have really high standards and don't want those standards to slip at all because we're not on site. And during the time that I've been doing this, Alex and I are both Superhosts, and so we've really been able to achieve that in a way that people are still very happy with their experience. And as Alex said, these are some guests who stayed in my home last summer. And this picture, this is what I want every time my guests check out of my house.
Now, in order to achieve that, we have to do it so we can actually keep our sanity, because it is quite nerve-wracking when you're far away, when you don't know what's going on, when you don't know what could have gone wrong. And that's exactly what we'd like to focus on. How can we give you the peace of mind, or how can you have that peace of mind to be the Superhost that you'd like to be? But let's first give you a little piece of something to think about. I think all of us have special touches as a host. And what we'd like to do is, at the end of this presentation, we're going to breeze through the 27 ideas that we'd like to share with you. But at the end of the presentation, wanted to give you a little bit of space and room to share with us what your special touches as a host are, and specifically what special touches you're able to deliver remotely. So we'd love to learn from you too, and we'd love for you to be able to share with the rest of the community. So if you can think about that a little bit as we jump through the rest of the presentation, and then if you could share it with us at the end, we'd very much appreciate it.
And the special touches that I do as a host, those are some of the things that I was most nervous about. because I didn't want those things to be missed when I wasn't the person there actually during the turnover. So was someone else going to leave flowers by the bedsides? Was someone else going to arrange breakfast? I leave breakfast and snack items for my guests. Was someone else was going to take care of that? So it's those extra special touches that we really want to make sure that are not lost when we're not there to tend to those things.
That's exactly right. So we've got 27 ideas on those special touches and on the things that we can do. Let me jump into those 27 ideas and let me give you a little bit of a layout of how we'd like to present those. We structured this into 3 sections. The first section is about communication. We think communication is absolutely critical to being successful as a remote host. And communication is all about making your guests feel close when you're actually far away. And sort of finding that right balance between helping them and making them feel like they're being hosted, but at the same time not being intrusive. So we'll have about 10 ideas on the topic of communication, and Tammi will cover most of those. The second section is going to focus on design, like not necessarily on design of your home. There's a few elements of that in there too, but mostly on designing the guest experience. And specifically, the area that we think can be really helpful is talking about how can you connect with your guests by sharing something about yourself that makes them feel that they belong, that makes them feel that, that they're actually a traveler, not a tourist. The third area is the one that gives us all headaches, or gives me a lot of headaches, which is operations. Because we'd like to be super hosts, we very much focused on the little details and how can we make sure that we can deliver those details even when we're far away. So let's jump into those 3 sections and let's get started with communication.
Great. So the first tip on communication is getting to know your guests. And I spend a lot of time partly, mostly because I'm really curious about people and I really want to understand who's coming to my home and what reason, like what they're doing in my city when they come, so that I can sort of tailor their experience. So I'm really thorough about reading people's profiles. I read people's reviews and not in a way to sort of, I do it to determine whether it would be, someone that I would want to have in my home, but also just to get a sense of who people are. And I ask people about the reason for their visit so that I can use all of that information to make sure that I'm delivering a personable experience for people. The second one is allowing guests to get to know you. I think one of the reasons that people choose to stay at an Airbnb as opposed to something like a hotel or even a listing on VRBO is that it's relationship-based. It's not just purely business transaction. I think people who are drawn to the platform of Airbnb are looking for a more personable, relationship sort of an experience. So allowing your guests to get to know you. And some of the things that I think are really important is having a complete Airbnb host profile. I've seen lots of profiles that are just very brief, and I think it's important to give people a sense of who you are, just to build a relationship with your guests. Sharing information about yourself and your home and your communication with guests. So I have a guest guide, it's written information, and I send that to guests ahead of time. And I inquire about their visits, and I also give them information about me as a host, about the home, and every piece of information that they would need to know, as well as my neighborhood and the city. And then I try to make connections with guests based on commonality. So, for example, if I read in someone's profile that they like yoga, I'll make sure that they know where the yoga studio is in my neighborhood.
And actually, one thing I should mention, what you're looking at here is Tammi's collection of aprons. Tammi loves the kitchen, and kitchen is actually a great place to connect with people. So if you like cooking and your guests like cooking, that's a great way to start a conversation, or to basically focus on your commonalities. Another tool that we like to use is we make sure that our messages are personalized and that we send a message prior to the guest's arrival. It gives them peace of mind that we're expecting them, that everything is sorted out for them. We reference details of their stay, and if we know what it is that they're coming for, like Tammi just said, we make sure that we reference that. So we know that they're in town for a wedding, we'll talk about that. If we know that someone is here for a business meeting, we'll make sure that we have an ironing board or an iron out or shoe polish or whatever they might need, so they're prepared for their stay. We always ask about any special requirements they may have, because it makes it easier then for them to ask. And we also, of course, try to give them tailored and specific assistance and recommendations. I mean, all of this, the idea is that we can tailor the experience and that we can make them feel hosted. The next area that's important is if you know that you'll be away, tell them. Managing expectations makes a huge difference. So our fourth point is tell your guests that you'll be away and make sure you have a backup plan. Make sure they know how to reach you. Make sure that there is someone that is there for you that can help out if something should happen. Making sure that they know in advance that you're not going to be there actually makes a big difference. Next area is
making sure that people have contact information so that your guests, if they have questions that come up, know who are your backup people that who can be responsive to them. And I found that I've never had an issue with being away, and I tell people specifically where I'm at, and sometimes that becomes a point of connection also. So I was recently one time that I was away, I was helping my grandmother move. And so my guest in the middle of their stay wrote and said, hey, how's the move going? And so, again, it's about building relationships, and it's about, a human relationship exchange with your guests, which I think is, again, what people are looking for.
Next area is the guest guide. That's an area I think that's important. We have a home manual. There's actually multiple ways to do that. There's quite a few companies springing up in that field, and we have a few ideas in our source list. But we talk about our house, we talk about a neighborhood, and we talk about things to do. We typically try to send them those, like the manual, as a PDF in advance of their stay, and we make sure that we include plenty of practical information. The next area, that's actually one that Tammi has perfected, is think about the concept of a home team, and I'll let Tammi explain that.
Okay, so this picture is a picture of myself with one of my very best friends. This is Jennifer, and so one of the things that I knew that I needed to do is create a home team. And some people have a home team who are sort of more paid people, and I compensate everyone who helps me, but there are people that I have found in my own circle of friends or community, neighborhood, that sort of thing, because again, I think it helps to create a more personable guest experience. So Jennifer is one of the people that I have in that group, and she's available and accessible to guests for questions. She helps me with turnovers occasionally. Making sure that all of your home team has contacts with each other so that they can be a network, and they have all the information about your home and know a little bit about your guests who are checking in. So another person that I have helping is Ian. He lives in another unit on my property, and he has a hard cider company. So as an example, I had some guests who were checking in, and he was getting the house ready for them, and so I happened to mention that they were coming to celebrate their 30th birthdays, and he said, oh, do you think they'd like a complimentary bottle of cider from my company? And so I checked with them, and they were really excited about that. So it's a way of engaging. Again, it's about relationships, and so the person who's helping you with your turnover is really a big part of establishing relationship, and a host partner is how I like to think of them. So it's an example of those people being engaged in creating and also helping with creating a good guest experience.
Now, in terms of partnership, we sort of need to create that connection with our guests too. So to be very specific, we think of 3 key points when we need to interact with our guests. The first one is at check-in, to make sure everything worked well. So we'd like to check, we basically like to be in contact with our guests just before they check in, to make sure that they're comfortable, that everything's taken care of. We try to check in with them very quickly after check-in, within the first half hour, to see if anything went wrong. We then check in with them once at mid-stay, just a really quick check-in saying, hey, is everything okay? Hope you're enjoying yourself. And if there's any problems, let me know. And then we check in with them one last time on the day or just before checkout, to double check that everything was fine and to remind them of the checkout procedure.
And one of the things that you'll note as Alex and I are talking is that even though we're not on site or in the same city, we're very much engaged. And so some of you who are on the call may be looking for a more distanced experience from your guest, in which case the best option might be, to have someone else manage your property. But if you still like that guest communication and want to personally create a personal guest experience, it does take a lot of engagement still, even when you're away.
So one way to reduce, to automate some of those things is try to be creative. So far what we've been talking about was fairly dry and very basic things. There's a way to be more creative about these things. What you're looking at here is actually a wall in my house in San Francisco where we painted a map of the neighborhood. And it's our way of communicating a neighborhood map. And then we have business cards of all of the restaurants and cafes that we like. What ended up happening with this is the wall took on a life of its own, as in people started writing reviews onto it, they started drawing onto it. Some of them consider themselves great artists and actually painted or wrote in chalk poetry, paintings, all kinds of things. So something that started as something very functional actually ended up becoming a really good way of not just connecting, for us to connect with our guests, but for guests to connect with each other. The other thing that was very interesting about this wall is that people ended up leaving reviews of places in the neighborhood that they've been to and recommending them to each other. So think about ways how you can be creative in communicating information to your guests. Tammi has magnetic poetry on her fridge, and people regularly leave her poems. So there's many ways to do that. Now, let's go back to something very basic, which is be responsive. It's a very basic requirement. Obviously, when a guest has a problem, the sooner you can respond to the guest, the sooner you can take care of it, and you can turn a bad experience into hopefully a good experience. Personal touches is something that Tammy's perfected, so let's have her talk about that.
Well, I think that we all get to be creative about what our personal touches are. Leaving notes for guests and letting those be personable notes. I leave, as I said before, snack and breakfast items, just very light, but I ask people ahead of time, I let them know that that's included, and tea and coffee is included. So I ask specifically, what do you like in your tea or coffee? Do you have any allergies or sensitivities or preferences that I should be aware of? And so I really tailor the experience in that way. And, Alex and I have been meeting a lot of hosts, and everyone has their unique sort of stamp that they put onto a guest experience. And so really thinking about, what's unique and creative from you that you can leave for your guests. If I know that guests are coming to go hiking, I'll leave out a hiking book. If guests are coming for a wedding, oftentimes you can't bring wrapped gifts on the plane if you're flying, so I'll leave wrapping paper. So just really including those tailored personal touches for your guests, I think is really important. And it's something that is part of hosting that I really love. So, hopefully that's something that you enjoy too.
Let me add one quick thing, and this actually recently came up in a host forum. Is one of the things that I like to leave behind is I always leave a bottle of bubbly, a bottle of champagne in the fridge for my guests. It's something that works really well for about 80% of all guests, but there's some percentage of guests who would rather not have alcohol in the house. So what I do is I leave a very subtle message before they arrive saying, hey, there is a bottle of champagne waiting for you in the fridge, which allows them to tell me if that's not something they would appreciate. So there's sort of ways to make sure you can really tailor it you can surprise them, but at the same time, you can tailor it to their to their specific preferences. All right, so that's it for communication. Let's jump into the next section, which is all about design. And what we're talking about is not so much design of the house, but design of the guest experience. The general idea here is that a big theme why people like to use Airbnb and not stay at a hotel is because they'd like to belong. They'd like to feel that they're travelers. They'd like to explore a neighborhood. They'd like to feel that that they belong to a place as opposed to just being a tourist. So we can help a lot with this because our life and our town is interesting to them. So there's an element of voyeurism sort of staying in Airbnb because you kind of can step into someone else's life. Now, it's a fine line to draw because your life and your town probably are interesting to your guests, but your sock drawer is probably much less interesting. So the next section deals with a series of ideas that allows you to sort of express that part that we know that our guests like, but at the same time giving them privacy and giving them their own space. So let me start with food. We talked about that earlier on. Food is a great way to connect. One of the things that Tammi does is during the summer, during the fall, she has a very nice plum tree in the back, and she puts plums from her plum tree into a bowl and offers it to her guests. That's the kind of thing that roots people, particularly if it's food that is relevant. So in San Francisco, we have some great cheese makers around the area in Northern California. So giving them local cheeses, presenting them with local wines, anything that has a story and that roots them locally, we think is very, very helpful to share something of yourself. Local experiences is another way of connecting your guests with you. There's a couple of technology tricks we use for that. There's a company called Detour that does some really interesting audio guides that are sort of quirky audio guides around a series of cities. There's a couple of other companies, Hostful is another one. Just giving your guests ideas about guided walks on how to explore your neighborhood and find your places, the places that you really like, can create a connection between you. And then sending them to businesses, local businesses that you know. If you have a hairdresser that you really like or a spa that you really like, make sure that your guests know about that and make them feel like locals that way.
I think one of the things that I do is when people come to Seattle, one of the main places that they go to is the Pike Place Market. A friend of mine has a booth there, and she runs the lavender store in the market. And so I let people know that if you want to go visit Melissa at the lavender store. And so then it helps people have an experience of something in your town or city that is sort of a rote thing that people would go see, but they get to have a personal experience at that place. So that's also really important. And oftentimes neighborhoods, like my neighborhood example, is not a place that tourists would go to when they're coming to my city, but because they're staying at my home, then they get to experience another neighborhood. So making sure that you're pointing out in your neighborhood what restaurants and coffee shops and stores and vendors and that sort of thing might be interesting to people.
Share something of yourself. The next picture is, if you don't quite see what you're looking at, is actually a great example of that. I stayed at an Airbnb in New Orleans in October. And the host that I stayed with, she loves Mardi Gras. She and her husband, they love Mardi Gras. And their costume for Mardi Gras every year is they build wings. And they build different sets of wings every year. You see actually them walking down the street in New Orleans with their wings doing Mardi Gras. And the entire decor of their house is around the theme of wings. You see a big set of wings over the bed. That's exactly the kind of inspiration or the kind of idea that I wanted to communicate here. This is something they are really passionate about, and they're connecting with their guests by actually making it a central feature of the decor of their house, and then by adding pictures of themselves. So you sort of get a little bit of a glimpse into their life. So this could be sharing a hobby, sharing art, sharing sort of an appreciation for some family heirlooms. Or just sharing a personal story or pictures, if you think that's appropriate. I mean, sort of this is the kind of example that I'm thinking about.
And pointing those out, like I have, my grandmother is a painter, and I have 2 of her paintings in my home. And so in my guest guide that I send ahead of time, I point that out to people. And it may or may not be something that people are interested, but people can, either read the guest guide or not. But I've had lots of sweet connections based on that. It's about sharing of yourself, and you never know, what's going to connect, where you're going to find a commonality with someone. So someone who's a painter is going to be really interested in that. Someone who also had a close relationship with their grandmother is going to be interested in that. So again, it's not being shy about sharing of yourself in your home to find those like human connections and points of commonality with your guests.
Another topic is
go ahead.
Sorry, Tammi. By the way, kudos to Tammi. Like the thing that I didn't mention is Tammi is completely flying blind, so she actually doesn't see the presentation. She can't see anything that's going on. All she is listening to what we're doing. So it's like she's doing an amazing job jumping in, but she's totally flying blind. another topic here is how to share local knowledge. That's an obvious one. Just tell your guests about the places in your neighborhood that you like. That's anything from restaurants, dive bars, cafes, or also practicalities like playgrounds, pharmacies, bike trails, running trails. I mean, that's an obvious one. Not so obvious, but one thing that's worked really well for me is share your music and favorite radio stations. It's a couple of things I do. Number one, I curated a playlist that's set up on my entertainment system. So when they switch it on, they have a selection of a couple of playlists I curated for them. There is one of sort of 60s bands from Northern California. Again, that roots them. There is stations that I really like. There's a great station, great Swedish jazz station that I like. There's a great Belgian blues station. It allows people to explore and to discover things that they wouldn't usually know about. And then, of course, talk about local venues and events that are happening while they're in your town. Sharing design ideas and inspiration is another idea. One of my, what you're looking at is a light fixture that I built in my house that's actually made from Sambuca bottles. I'm Italian. This is a drink that I grew up with, and I made a light fixture out of it. It's just something that's interesting. You can show people your Pinterest collection or anything that sort of gives them a glimpse into your life. Next idea is about books, magazines, and movies. People like to explore, like to discover. I like to leave my books out and give them a little bit of a glimpse in things that I'm interested in. So if you have an interesting collection of books, by all means, leave it on the shelf and give people a little bit of a view into things that they could discover. I've actually been really surprised about how guests respond to that. And I had several guests that sent me emails saying, hey, there's a book that I discovered on your shelf that I really enjoyed. Do you know other books by this writer? Because I really like this one. Or one guest that read one of the books and then accidentally put it into his suitcase, and he was really embarrassed about that and offered to replace it for me. And I just asked him to keep it because it's a book that I read a long time ago, and I enjoyed it. That he got some enjoyment out of it. So again, it's a way for you to connect with your guests. Let's talk about the kitchen. It's a great topic for Tammi again.
So Alex and I really love to be in the kitchen, and we both really love to cook. So we have, we have fully stocked kitchens. We have, lots of kitchen gadgets and things that people would like to use, and cookbooks. As you know, my kitchen has aprons in it, and so both Alex and I really encourage guests to use our kitchens, and I think that's. Again, it's another one of those reasons that people book an Airbnb as opposed to a hotel, because people really love to be in the kitchen. So I had some guests recently who it was a family. They were coming from Japan. Their two sons were studying in the U.S. They were all meeting as a family in Seattle for a vacation. And afterwards they said, thank you so much. Our sons really miss their mom's cooking, and so we got to have family meals, and that was really special. So making sure that people can have that sort of rooted at-home experience in your home with a well-stocked kitchen. And the next one is share trappings of being local. So in Seattle, something that's essential is umbrellas. Even though Seattleites don't use umbrellas, guests, people not used to the amount of rain that we have are going to want that. Local travel guides, parking passes, public transportation information, anything that's going to help orient your guests to your city and help them have a good experience navigating your city and getting around. So again, all of these things, these are just some ideas that Alex and I have come up with and implemented. But again, I want to stress that everything is unique. So this is a framework that we've provided, but what's really our intention is to get people to think about what's unique about you, about your home, about your neighborhood, about your city, and so that you can, extend those things to your guests.
So we
spent a lot of time on that section because Alex and I both really like it, but I think we can get into operations now.
Yeah, so exactly. So operations is next, and operations is the thing that's actually probably the least fun for all of us, and that's the thing that tends to give me a headache and give some of us anxiety. So let's talk about a couple of tips and tricks that have helped us make this a little bit less of a daunting task. So the first thing that I do is I install the remote access method all around my house. There's a couple of ways to do this. I'm using smart locks. The smart lock that I use specifically is August. There's 3 or 4 others, and you'll find all of those in our source file. For that, what I'd recommend to you is always think about a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, because whenever you use anything electronic, at some point it's not going to work. So what I do is I have a primary entry method, which is my smart lock, that allows me to send guests as many electronic keys as they'd like to, which means I don't have to worry about them losing keys or having 5 keys floating around. It also allows me to know that they have arrived because I get a notification and I know that they have left. So it has a couple of interesting features like that. But I wouldn't actually get rid of my lockbox, which I also have. I actually have 2 lockboxes, one for guests that don't want an electronic key because they're not that technology savvy or it's not something that they're interested in. And then I have a second lockbox that is hidden away because every 10 or 15 guests, it happens that at 2 o'clock in the morning after the bar crawl, the guest forgot their key somewhere and they give me a call, and then I have to figure out how I get them in. The first few times I had to travel across town, and I've gotten wise since and figured out that I just put a second lockbox there with a different code that allows them to get in. Another sort of technology trick that I use is I have a connected thermostat and connected fire alarms. The thermostat allows me to turn up the heat just before the guests arrive, so they arrive at a nice and warm home. And if I see that someone accidentally runs the thermostat at full tilt for the whole week, then I can turn it down remotely too. What the fire alarm allows me to do is it allows me to know that all of the batteries have been replaced and to make sure that all of the batteries are still charged and to make sure that the guests are safe. And if anything happens, I get remote notifications. So again, it adds to my peace of mind. The next area is if you live or if you're hosting in an apartment building, you have to figure out how to get people into the building. And for that, there's a number of key exchanges. Key Cafe is one that I like, but there's multiple options there. Again, you find them in our source file, and that's a great way of getting that practicality. The next topic is about a checklist, and I'll let Tammi start talking about that.
Great. So as I mentioned before, the first time that I hosted remotely, I was going away to, I was going to be in England for 3 weeks. And so what I did to get prepared for that is I had a friend of mine who I hired to do the turnovers for me. Actually, I had 2 people that I hired. And I created a schedule for who was doing which turnovers when, and I met with both of them extensively ahead of time, showed them around the house, made sure they knew where everything was, tried to show them how I liked things arranged and how I liked the house staged, and what food to leave out for guests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then I wrote an extensive, Word document of a guide of how to do things. And so it was very labor intensive, and prior to and at the end of each stay, I would send them communication about the guests and that sort of thing. So it was a very intensive, labor intensive way to do that, and it worked beautifully. But again, it took a lot of time on my part. So one of the things that I was interested in when I first met Alex is it told me about this app that he was creating that would do exactly that. And so I was recalling back to when I was sending all of those extensive emails and checklists to the people who were helping my turnover. And so what Alex and his company have created is a way to visually send a checklist to someone who's completing your turnover. And it's a much more streamlined process for me. I'm very particular about the details. So one of the things that I love about this is that someone is actually able to see a picture exactly how I want things staged in every room, and provides to give people reminders and show people exactly where things are in their home. And a visual image is so much better than the emails that I was sending to people, because it's also time intensive for them to be able to go back and reference an email rather than just looking at a picture and having a way to check those off. So as a host, this has been a really sort of a game changer for me, and really made things much simpler. And it's simpler for the people on the turnover side too. So I'm going to let Alex talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to give people a sense of my experience as a host who's been using this app.
Yeah, that's basically, that was the pain point that I started with. I didn't know how to convey a complicated turnover process to my cleaner, particularly not when the cleaner changed very frequently. I use on-demand cleaning services like Handy, and that's been very much hit and miss. So like, just to get over that one additional obstacle of actually having a complicated process explained simply, that's why I created this. I don't want to focus too much on this because we're covering 27 ideas, and this is just one of them. But anybody who's interested in a visual checklist, you can download it at getproperly.com. We're working closely with Airbnb, and we're fully integrated with Airbnb, so you can use your Airbnb username and password. We're still in trial stage. Everything is free, so there's no payment for that whatsoever. We're trying this together with Airbnb, and I'd very much like your feedback on it. Let's jump to the next section, which is, or the second part of this. A checklist obviously is only as good as the person who's, or actually can only be as good as the person who's executing it. And that's the turnover help that you have. By the way, we keep on going back and forth. We started talking about cleaners, but cleaners really doesn't describe the person who does this very well. I think as a community, we really have a gap here in that what we're looking for is someone who's a hospitality assistant, and what's out there is a cleaner, and somehow we have to bridge between the gap between those two. But what I'd like to focus on here is when you find that person, make sure you have a plan B and a plan C, because things always happen. So in my case, I have my regular sort of service provider, and anytime they're available, I'll always use them. And then my plan B is I have an on-demand service that if they're not available, I have I usually get them to find someone for me. And then I've got a plan C, which is a good friend who, if there's an emergency at the very, very last moment, they can help out. So think about your strategy. This is one of the things that's really, really critical. This is sort of the one thing that makes it or breaks it. So make sure you have a plan B and a plan C for that. The next element is, many people think that when you're away, you just have to drop the little details. But as we tried to talk about at the beginning of this presentation, it's all about the little details. So it's all about those little details that make us hopefully the great hosts that we'd like to be. So it's things like the coffee machine, like have we restocked the coffee machines? Are there filters for the coffee machine? Is there ground coffee for it? Have we restocked everything around the house? Are all the soap containers full? Dishwashing liquid container, toilet paper, tissues? Is there a welcome present for the guest? Is there handwritten notes so they feel that they're actually a person and that we're hosting them, not just a generic customer? If we're offering breakfast, have we arranged for that? And is the breakfast actually customized for the guest? If someone's gluten intolerant, like, let's not give them granola. So it's all those little details. Again, for us, using a checklist to manage that makes it much easier, because even if the person who's helping us with the turnover has not done this before, it allows us to give them a very granular expectation of what we'd like them to do. Miscommunication is another big topic. Tammi and I like to use photos for that. In terms of, once we send someone a checklist of what we'd like them to do, there's a risk that we're not clear. There's less of a risk if we use a checklist, but there's still a risk that we're not clear. So the easiest way to resolve this is, number one, sending them a picture of how we'd like something to look or what it is that we're referring to, and then getting a picture back from them, like a few pictures back from them, so we know that they understood what we asked them to do and we explained ourselves clearly. It also allows us to give them feedback. One of the things that we noticed is it's a terrible job to be a cleaner, because typically or very often when you're dealing with a remote host, you're basically sandwiched between one group of guests and the next group of guests. The guests don't know you and they have an expectation that the place is clean. So if you did an amazing job, you're never going to hear anything from anyone because that was their expectation in the first place. But if they find one hair somewhere, there's going to be a complaint. So the best thing that can happen to you as the cleaner is you don't get any feedback. And the worst thing that can happen to you is you get negative feedback. By having them send us a few pictures back of the job that they've done, we tell them that we care about their work and we tell them that we appreciate it, and we'll get back to them right away and we'll let them know that. the last topic is like making a plan for restocking. And restocking is sort of one of those necessary things that we sometimes don't think about, but that is very, very important. At the end of the day, there needs to be a shopping list. There needs to be like something of a plan about what we're going to do about that toilet paper that just ran out or the tissue paper that just ran out. We're in an urban area, so what we do is there is a number of same-day delivery services. We're actually going to do a webinar on that topic soon, and we're going to zoom in on that specific topic. But there's many resources that you can use to make sure that the restocking is taken care of. We are almost at the end. The last very important topic is what if things go wrong. That's 27 out of 27. Make sure that you have a plan B again. So these are the things that you don't expect to happen, but sooner or later you will need an electrician for an emergency, you will need a plumber, you may need a locksmith, or you'll need a handyman to fix something while you're away. So make sure you have those contacts handy, make sure that you have good providers, and make sure you're prepared for that. And if you're prepared for it, it'll make it just so much easier, and it'll give you peace of mind when it actually happens. And sooner or later it will, and it's not that big of a deal if you're prepared for it. Let me sum up.
I really encourage people to, again, use your resources. So think of paid professionals, but also think of who is in your circle of friends, family, neighbors, that sort of thing. My brother lives in town, and so he's one of my people who's backup. If I can't reach a plumber, or if I can't reach an electrician or something like that. So just again, it's about you and your town, neighborhood, circle, and really sort of asking people to be available in that way.
Yeah, so to sum up, the key point that we wanted to make is when you're a remote host, connection brings you closer. And we talked about 3 strategies to connect with your guests. Number 1, communicate, and that's the most important part. Communicate to establish a connection. Number 2, design the guest experience to share something of yourself and to make your guests feel at home. And then number 3, operations. And if there's one thing I want to say about operations, it's just think ahead, be prepared and organized, and it's not going to be that big of a problem. For each of the topics that we talked about, and specifically for the topic around checklists, we have other webinars. And we actually about to do a checklist webinar. So if you're on our mailing list, we have a detailed webinar on just how to build a checklist and how to deal with operations. We'll also soon be doing a webinar on technology, and specifically technology around access and home automation. So any of those things that you might be interested in, we'll have webinars around that. So what you see on the screen is all the materials that you just saw. You can download them from getproperly.com, and Tammi and I would be very happy if you have any questions. You feel free to contact us directly, and you see our email addresses down below. So let me go back to a live view again, or at least try to do so. And now I'm very happy, or Tammi and I are very happy to answer your questions. So I see a first question from Robert, which is actually a highly technical question. He's asking whether we have an API or whether Airbnb has an API that we connect with, and the answer is yes, they do, and we have a full integration with that API. I think it's way too technical a question to discuss with the rest of the group, so feel free to send me an email, and I'm very happy to point you to the right resources at Airbnb to discuss it with them directly. Let me answer a couple of other questions. Like someone asked, do we notify our guests in advance that we won't be home? We covered that. Yes, absolutely. I think managing expectations is something that's really important. Tammi, maybe you want to chime in on that. That's something that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's always important to let people know, and to let people know if you are or are not going to be available. So I'm really direct and honest about the fact that I'm going to be out of town and where I'm going to be and what I'm going to be doing. Again, I think it's part of building guest relationships. And I let people know, when I will be available and if there are times that I'm not going to be available. And my sort of personal policy for myself is that I always try to make sure that I'm available to guests when I'm away and when they're in my home. But as an example, when Alex and I were traveling to Paris for Airbnb Open, my guest was checking in at the time that I was going to be on a flight. And so I just said, I'm on my way to Paris. Here's what I'm going for. I'm going to be, flying when you check in. But if you have any questions, like here's everything that you need to know. But if something comes up, or if you have any questions, this is who you contact, and this is their contact information. And then make sure that the person that I'm, that is my backup at that time knows what time the guests are checking in, just so that it's part of communication. Communication is about building those relationships with guests, but it's also about making sure that everyone has every piece of information that they might need so that things go smoothly. So I always tell people that I'm going to be gone if I'm going to be out of the city, or when I'm going to be back, and I let people know that I'm available during that time. I think it's important.
Let me answer another question that just came in. Lisa asked, how do you make sure if you provide a fully stocked kitchen, how do you prevent loss? I think it's a tricky question. It really depends on your price point, and it depends on what kind of guests you usually expect. My experience is, let me preface this, that I have a relatively high price point. This is a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in San Francisco. So our average nightly rate is $500. So at that level, we are fine to provide even expensive things. I have truffle oil and I have truffle salt, and I let guests liberally help themselves to that. It actually surprises them, and they appreciate it. And in the scheme of things, it doesn't make a huge difference to me at the rates that I'm charging. And the one thing that I've been really surprised about is I've actually never seen anybody take advantage of it. I first usually lock those things away, and then a couple of times I forgot to lock them away, and I noticed that people, number one, appreciated it, and number two, didn't abuse it. But it depends what price point you're at, and it depends a little bit on the guests. This is something you just have to experiment with. Is it giving you goodwill? Is it helping you? Is it giving you a chip in the bank with the guests? Or does it become too high of a cost? So just play around with it and sort of see what you want to make available. Also explore whether you can raise your prices. I've actually been able to raise prices multiple times because I've got a series of good reviews. I now use dynamic pricing, and dynamic pricing brings up my prices sometimes by $100 to $200 per night. It's very much like you'll have to decide what works for you. I know Tammi wanted to chime in.
Yeah, my price point is very different. It's quite a bit lower than Alex's, but I still have an open kitchen policy. I leave all of my basics like flour, sugar, all of those kinds of things in the kitchen, and I encourage people to use things if they need to. And I've never had anyone abuse things. I even used to leave my alcohol cabinet, sort of open. Everything was just on a shelf, and I had some guests who, got a little bit liberal with the bourbon, but then 2 weeks later, literally, some other guests were there and went on a bourbon, a distillery tour, and left the leftover bottle. So it was just it was sort of like that spirit of generosity and trust, and I loved how it all balanced out. And I find that when you do that, you're sort of sending a message of trust and generosity to your guests. And my guests have always really responded. And I think it almost encourages people to take better care of your home and to be more respectful of your space and your things. I've only had 3 things broken. Every guest has reported it to me and asked if they could replace it, and I've just said, don't worry about it. I'm happy to cover the replacement cost. But Airbnb does have the built-in policy if you're asking for a deposit, that if something that's a higher price point thing, like a blender or something that's more expensive in your kitchen is broken, that you can ask for reimbursement for that. So, guests can repay that. But I personally, again, have hosted close to 100 groups of people and have never had an issue.
Yeah, same with me. I've hosted 50 groups of people and never had any issue at all. Never ever had an issue with it. Let me read a question from Claude. How often is the communication by text or email as opposed to by phone? Voice communication is warm, but a lot of guests don't have a cellular rate that enables them to use their phone abroad. Yeah, Claude, it's a very good point. We try to answer in 2 ways. Almost all of my communication is by email or text. I see that guests typically prefer that, and I'd like to respond to them in the communication channel that they choose. So I typically communicate with them by text or by phone, by text or by email, not by phone. I had one or two circumstances where someone called me, and if they called me, like I sort of asked them if it was okay to call them back, and if the answer is yes, then then that's the communication channel that I use. There's another interesting point, Claude, that you raise, which is foreign guests. At my place, about 40 to 50% of the guests are coming from abroad. I have lots of European guests and a good number of Australian guests. One of the things that we can do for them, and I'm starting to experiment with that, is actually leave a SIM chip behind for them. So they can sort of have allow them to have a prepaid SIM chip that they can use. We can either throw it in as a complimentary service, or we can add it onto the tab for them. But I'm just starting to experiment with this. I don't quite know how well it's going to work, but it's something that's always important to me when I travel abroad. So this is something that I think might be very useful for them. I think we're almost out of time. If anybody has any sort of personal touches, the thing that we mentioned at the beginning, and wants to share them with the group, I'd very much appreciate that. Or otherwise, I think, actually, there's another question coming in from Gail. And Gail's asking, is all of your email communication via the Airbnb platform, or do you get direct emails? As far as emails concerned, all of that always goes through the Airbnb platform. I know there is a couple of discussions going on, particularly in the sort of vacation rental forums, about trying to get guests' email addresses so you can then market to them afterwards and establish a direct relationship. I actually personally haven't done that. But what I do is I typically communicate by text directly with them. Once the reservation comes through, I see their phone number, so I text them directly and I don't go through the Airbnb service. But as far as email communication is concerned, I go through the Airbnb platform, and that's sort of the only way I communicate with them. But that's something, that's my own personal preference. There's sort of a movement on the sort of vacation rental side of saying that we should have access to email addresses of our guests so we can contact them directly, and then specifically so we can remarket to them. The remarketing component for me is less of an issue because it's an urban destination, and typically it's more sort of an ad hoc kind of guests. But if it's a vacation destination like beach or mountains, where you have guests that come regularly every year, you may want to have a way for them to contact you directly. So it's a little bit of an aside, doesn't have necessarily to do with remote hosting, but it's a very active topic of conversation, and so I wanted to mention it really quickly. We're almost at the hour point, so if anybody has any other questions, I'm still looking at the chat. If anybody has any tips or things that have worked really well for them, please share them with us, and we'd love to integrate them into our next presentation. If anybody is interested in going deeper on any of the topics that we've discussed today, we do regular webinars on the topic of checklists. We'll do one on home automation soon, and sort of all the topics that come up around remote hosting. Thank you very much for your time today. I think we'll close out at this point. I don't see any more questions. Thanks so much for Tammi to actually manage this big technological feat. If you wanna say bye to everyone, like that.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, everyone. Alex and I both always love talking about hosting stuff, so we can sort of get on a roll. And I'm glad hope you enjoyed the time, and we look forward to the next time.
All right, thank you very much, everyone, and
bye-bye.
Happy hosting. Bye.